First and foremost, I'm a bit humbled to be here in Sweden with you all. It's my second time in Gothenburg and a real delight and opportunity. But in the country of Greta Thunberg, I thought I would tell a story. And it's a story about my older son, who has told me multiple times, "Daddy, you work on the wrong issue." And the wrong issue being that he is very focused on climate change. And I would argue, as I have to him, I don't think I've convinced him as I hope I will you, but we'll see, that even if we cool the planet, if we don't tackle the single leading challenge, environmental challenge of our time in endocrine disrupting chemicals, we will leave a planet that will be cooler, but will be fundamentally transformed by the damage that will have been wrought by this category of emerging chemicals of concern in people's lives. So humbly, I submit that to you as the broader thesis in case I put you to sleep during the course of this presentation. But I have no slides, and I intend to move around and do as much as I can. And you've had fika, after all. So let me begin with a story, which is that I feel very privileged to stand on the shoulders of giants who made this field really develop. And the story begins in 1962 with the book Our Silent Spring. Now, at the time, Rachel Carson beautifully describes the narrative of the pesticide DDT and its impact on wildlife and the herald that it brought for the potential consequences for human health. Not long thereafter, a group of astute physicians at the Massachusetts General Hospital identified a case cluster of young girls with an extremely rare cancer, an adenocarcinoma of the vagina. And then they went back into the medical records and documented carefully all the potential other explanations, of which they could find none, and found a startling difference between the matched comparison children, the matched comparison girls, and the girls with the cancer. And that is that all of the girls with the cancer were exposed to diethylstilbestrol, a pharmaceutical that was given with good intentions to prolong pregnancy and reduce symptoms associated with pregnancy, and to avoid other potential adverse consequences during pregnancy. It's the only manuscript in the New England Journal of Medicine I'm aware of for which the odds ratio, which is a statistical construct we use to evaluate differences between exposed and unexposed groups, of infinity. That is, that it was 8 cases perfectly predicted in relationship to diethylstilbestrol exposure, and the matched comparisons all did not have diethylstilbestrol exposure in utero. Now, why do I make these two cases or stories to begin the talk? Well, at the time, the thought process was that these were rare mistakes, if you will. Very high levels of exposure. After all, DDT was being sprayed. Hillary Clinton describes it in her book as running in the mist of DDT in Illinois as a child growing up. Not that I would advise that, but that's what children did in that era. And then diethylstilbestrol is a pharmaceutical given in a relatively high amount at the time, intended to have a specific hormonal effect at a pharmacologically relevant high-level dose exposure. Now, there was a notion at the time that carried through all the way when I was a medical student, starting in 1994, about 30 some odd years later, where the dose makes the poison, as Paracelsus put it. And the bigger quote is, only the dose, and the only is important, makes the thing a poison. So we assumed for a long period of time that only high levels of exposure to chemicals in our environment could have the impact that would be substantial on people's lives. Now, unfortunately, the game has shifted. The science has caught up, especially over the past 2 decades. We've seen rapidly accelerating evidence that actually the lowest levels of exposure are where the biggest changes in the human body can happen. Low levels matter. Little things matter. First, actually, we found it with a chemical we don't usually think of as, it's actually a metal, heavy metal, lead. We don't think of that as an endocrine disrupting chemical. It has endocrine disrupting potential effects, but they're not probably the main effects that are explaining the effects on the brains of children. But we now know it's not just lead, but methylmercury, pesticides, brominated flame retardants can all have these low-level effects on people's lives. And the reason for that is grounded in basic biology. If you think of the natural hormones in our body, even something that's not a hormone, the oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve, literally how our body functions, the curve is not a straight line. And actually, you can have big changes within certain ranges of exposure. And so with lead, the lowest levels of exposure where you have the biggest drops in cognitive potential. And this has been borne out time and again in study after study, first in the laboratory and now increasingly in humans. The Endocrine Society put this issue on the scientific map in 2009, roughly a decade ago, which is quite startling when you think about it. That's how rapidly the science has changed here in this situation. Then in 2012, the World Health Organization and the United Nations Environment Program documented this issue as a global public health concern. Then in 2015, the Endocrine Society was so shocked by the rapid acceleration of the evidence, particularly in humans, that with its 1,331 scientific references, it put a second scientific statement right after the first. Usually academic societies take a decade or maybe 2 to do it because it takes a lot of work to write these kinds of papers up and vet them through the review. But 6 years later, they needed to update the literature. And then my own American Academy of Pediatrics documented the concerns about chemicals intentionally and unintentionally added to food in 2018. So as much as it's shocking to see a 500-year-old scientific notion, after all, Paracelsus, or Theophrastus Bombastus von Hohenheim, as he's called, the Swiss philosopher, physician, savant, described it, has largely faded to, it's much more complicated than simply only the dose makes the poison. In fact, timing, context of all the exposures in our environment, a host of other factors are brutally important. Let me give a couple of examples where the science has really caught up, telling us that these chemicals are especially important for their effects on people's lives at these low doses of exposure. So brominated flame retardants and pesticides are known to affect the function of thyroid hormone in the human body. Now as a pediatrician, I'm happy to say we lead the way in thinking about thyroid hormone. Every little baby here in Sweden, and I'm sure across the world now pretty much, gets their heel stick tested for newborn, what we call newborn blood spots, to check for congenital hypothyroidism. Now, congenital hypothyroidism is an eminently treatable deficiency in thyroid hormone. It's a privilege to be able to identify those children, proactively intervene, and give them thyroid hormone. And then you prevent them from a lifetime of intellectual disability. And we used to think that it was only these gross perturbations in thyroid hormone that really mattered. Unfortunately, now we know that for pregnant women earlier in baby's development, thyroid hormone is crucially important for the baby because the baby doesn't make thyroid hormone until the second trimester of pregnancy. So the baby is relying on mom's thyroid hormone. And even in the clinically normal range, this is crippling because OBs are actually have their hands tied behind their backs. They can't tell when a mom is having a significant effect on their baby as a result of deficiencies in thyroid hormone. So this is the normal range. Like you check the mom's thyroid hormone level, everything looks fine. But even in the clinically normal range, subtle shifts in thyroid hormone have been proven to affect not just cognitive function, but to even produce clinically significant deficits in like autism and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Now, the studies linking chemical exposures to, like pesticides and flame retardants with autism directly are still difficult to conduct because fortunately or not fortunately, autism is still relatively rare. We're up to 4% of boys who have autism in the United States. But the fact is that still, because it's relatively rare, it's tough to get the big populations you need to tease out the exposure and the effect in those populations. But in populations where you can observe cognitive potential, you see decreases in intellectual quotient or IQ testing, which has implications not just for IQ scores, but for our broader economy. So I'd like to say that if a child comes back with one less IQ point, maybe mom doesn't notice, maybe no offense, the pediatrician might not notice, the teacher might not notice, but if 100,000 children come back with one less IQ point, the entire economy notices. Each IQ point is worth roughly 2% of a child's lifetime economic productivity. And if on average a child makes $1 million over his or her lifetime, 2% times $1 million is $20,000. Just to use the European context, if you think that if 4 million people or kids are born each year, $20,000 times 4 million children, or even let's say 15, I can't do the kroner calculation off the top of my head, but so even if it's 15,000 euro per person, you're still talking about a number with a lot of zeros at the right end. We're talking about in the United States potentially billions, $80 billion as a result of one IQ point across the entire cohort. So as much as we talk about chemicals driving the economy, we're actually potentially undermining the basic economic engine of our society if we make kids less well able to contribute as members of society. Now, there's another area where the scientific evidence has exploded of late, and that is that chemicals can literally make us fatter. There is now evidence for 50 chemical obesogens. They've actually come up with a way of describing it as obesogens because that's how big the literature has gotten, pardon the pun. We know, for example, that one chemical used in the lining of aluminum cans, bisphenol A or BPA, makes fat cells bigger. It disrupts the function of a protein that protects the heart called adiponectin, and it's a synthetic estrogen, so literally can have sex-specific effects on body mass. Now, I want to make an interesting historical parallel, which is quite frightening, which at this point, which is that DES was the pharmaceutical pick for pregnant women back in the 1950s. BPA was around at that time and was considered as a pharmaceutical in lieu of DES. We could very well have had the BPA story and not the DES story, but BPA was not potent enough, which speaks to how we've picked high dose exposures because at the time we understood that that was how things worked in the human body, but now we've come so far in our understanding of science that these lower levels of exposure can be equally impactful. I always find that to be quite a frightening thought that we could have had the BPA story instead of the DES story. They would have taken larger pills, so maybe that would not have worked. In addition, we've found that chemicals can actually also have effects on reproductive function. And there is evidence, for example, that phthalates, chemicals used in cosmetics, personal care products, and food packaging, can disrupt sperm count. We've seen epic declines globally in developed countries especially, some 60% decline in sperm count over the past 3 decades. And that's a trend line that goes all the way back, if you draw it, to the 1940s by Neil Skakavek and colleagues, and then subsequently by Haggai Levine and colleagues in just a couple of years ago. And this is an ongoing decline. Now, it's not even just a sperm count thing. Yes, we need a population to produce for the economy, and that matters. And if couples need medications or assisted reproductive technologies, given the emotion and the will that families have about having a family, the impacts can be profound. But these are also chemicals that have impact on people who are not trying to have a baby. There is an increasing literature that suggests that these chemicals can impact actually potency. So for example, phthalates are known to disrupt testosterone, which is the major hormone for behind the male libido. In addition, it's not just a lifestyle matter. It can literally be, for adult men, a life or death matter. Low T is either a marker for or predictor of adult cardiovascular disease in men. So we've actually documented tens of thousands of men in Europe who die each year as a result of subtle shifts in testosterone function, even within the so-called clinically normal range. But those shifts in testosterone are associated with increased risk of coronary heart disease in these men. So we're not literally just talking about things that affect a few IQ points here or there, or maybe one change in waist size for your pants. This can literally have huge societal consequences. So this is all fairly depressing at some level, and it should at some level. We're talking about things that affect Europe to the tune of 163 billion euro. That's 1.2% of our gross domestic product here in Europe each year. If it makes you feel better, in the era of Trump, the United States has a cost profile of $340 billion a year, 2.3% of our gross domestic product. So we actually get hit worse on the place where I came from last night. Now, there's a difference there that has a deeper story behind it, and it's important to emphasize because it starts to get us towards a solution. So policy predicts exposure, exposure contributes to disease, and disease ultimately costs us all. So let's take the story of the flame retardant chemicals, the chemicals used in furniture, electronics, and even carpeting. So in the United States, we required every piece of furniture to be sprayed with flame retardant since the 1970s, up until about 2013. And that was with good intentions. After all, I remember being a kid in the 70s, living in the West Village of Manhattan, and I saw a tobacco smoker die across the way in my rent control apartment building in Manhattan, literally because he had been smoking in bed, and the fire had blazed and he had died. So the intention was to slow fires and save lives. Well, the bad news is it didn't slow fires, and it actually ended up inhibiting thyroid hormone and affecting the cognitive development of kids. I'll also shock you with one other statistic. The law we're talking about that required flame retardants be added was from liberal California that required this in the first place. But the reason I bring up this story is that in Europe, the requirements for flame retardants, they've been used, don't get me wrong. I'm very aware of the flame retardant cat book in Sweden. But the reality is that there have been much lower uses of those chemicals in Europe compared to the United States. And they actually were banned sooner in the United States than they were phased out in California in 2013, excuse me. So what happens as a result of that is when you cost up the disease burden due to flame retardants in the United States, it's $282 billion a year, $240 billion a year. In Europe, it's in the $40 billion range. The opposite, of course, unfortunately, is the case for pesticides. So I can't reassure you completely. As much as bio has taken much more hold in Europe than in the United States, the US, through its Food Quality Protection Act, required an additional safety factor such that certain organophosphates were much less used and much less detected in the bodies of people as a result of that policy action. So the costs in the United States are on the order of $20 billion or so, and in Europe they're on the order of 121 billion euro of that 163 billion euro total. Now, it's not all about government that has to keep us from doing something, though I'm much more hopeful about the current European context compared to the American one right now. There are safe and simple steps we can all take to limit these exposures of greatest concern. So, for example, I've talked about bisphenols and bisphenol A. BPA is used mainly in two cases: in the linings of aluminum cans to prevent corrosion, and in thermal paper receipts. So avoiding canned foods is a straightforward way to reduce your bisphenol exposure, and study after study in families have actually shown 50 to 60% drop-offs in urinary levels of bisphenols and phthalates, by the way, simply by substituting diet with a diet free of food packaging, and in particular canned food. Saying no to that thermal paper receipt is important because the bisphenols don't only get in through the intestine, through your mouth, and absorb that way. They absorb in your skin and ultimately into your body. In avoiding phthalates is actually straightforward insofar as you mind your plastics in particular. In the United States, we use the recycling number, and it's a little bit different, I understand, in Europe, but we use the numbering system. So we use the numbers 3, 6, and 7. 3 are for phthalates, or PVC. I believe the PVC is on the recycling triangle here in Europe. 6 is for PS, or polystyrene, which is a known styrene is a known carcinogen. And 7 is PC, or polycarbonate, which contains bisphenols, which we've already talked about. Now, the reason I suggest avoiding canned food consumption across the board, even if there is a BPA-free movement that has taken a lot of momentum of late, is that there are many replacement bisphenols. There are about 40 or so that now exist: BPS, BPF, BPP, BPZ. I call them artists formerly known as BPA as a tribute to Prince. But the reason why it's a concern may not feel like such a tribute, in that BPS, one replacement, is as estrogenic, as toxic to embryos, and as persistent in the environment. So in many ways, some of the benefits that were touted as being due to getting BPA out and substituting with a BPA substitute may not be actually realistic. In addition, eating organic is a straightforward way to reduce your pesticide exposure. It's been proven, by the way, not only in high-income populations, but in low-income populations to successfully reduce your pesticide exposure in children, which is a great piece of news. Yes, there is a price margin associated with bio or with organic, but in the United States, at least, we've seen an acceleration in market share such that that's actually driven the price margin. And in our so-called big box stores, this is the American way that we have, you see organic and conventional side by side with relatively little price difference. It's also for families where the financial dynamics are difficult for making these kinds of decisions that might actually have an economically costly increment. What I often suggest is focusing on eating organic for the leafy greens and vegetables, where you eat that outer layer and thereby absorb more pesticide. The Environmental Working Group in the United States has a so-called dirty dozen list of fruits and vegetables that have the highest pesticide residues. And this is straightforward advice that I give to my patients at Bellevue Hospital. It's the flagship hospital of the public hospital system in New York City that serves a lot of low-income populations. So this isn't something that is just for the well-to-do. This is something that we all can potentially do. And I also emphasize to them that, for example, eating an avocado that may not be organic may be less important than picking a lettuce or spinach that is organic, because you don't eat that outer layer of the avocado as opposed to the outer layer of the lettuce or spinach. For flame retardants in the United States, we have made a lot of progress here. California now requires disclosure on new furniture in a label that either says flame retardant added or no flame retardant added. And in addition to using a wet mop to sop up all the persistent organic pollutant dust that can accumulate in the environment, simply opening the window is a straightforward way to recirculate the air and get rid of those persistent organic pollutants that can accumulate in homes. Now, that's a lot to ask people to do. I don't ask the patients I see at Bellevue Hospital to do all of that in one clinic visit. I usually do take two things, write them down, that's very important, and hand them as feedback to the families. But I have had a lot of hope because of the power of the pocketbook, the wallet, or purse. BPA-free is not perfect, but it has spawned a conversation. And the thing that makes me feel a lot better is the BPA ban on baby bottles and sippy cups that the US Food and Drug Administration implemented was not driven by science, actually. There was enough science in 2008. There's much more science now. But it was the media attention and it was the public focus on this issue that accelerated the companies and drove them to say, we have to change our manufacturing practices. They ran to the US Food and Drug Administration and insisted on the ban because they said, we got it out already. It's not an issue for us anymore. So in addition, more recently with the perfluoroalkyl substances, the non-stick chemicals used in a lot of food packaging, it took a study of 5 food packages from 2 major supermarket chains, and literally you saw on Facebook and Instagram companies moving their old food packaging, setting them aside, and then replacing them with a safer set of alternatives. So I firmly believe that we can be the change that we seek. So again, I may not have convinced you. I don't always convince my older son in that regard. He's a tween after all, so that doesn't help. But I do hope that I've at least stimulated some dialogue. And I think that's what gives me the greatest hope. We may get in this discussion from 1% of endocrine disrupting people knowing about endocrine disrupting chemicals to 2 or 3%. But the reality is that 99% of us are affected by these exposures that are so common in our lives. We're talking about obesity, diabetes, autism, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, breast cancer, testicular cancer, a host of conditions. We probably all know someone in our close circle of personal friends or family who've been affected by these conditions. And yet there are safe and simple steps we can take to reduce our exposure. And this isn't something that has to take years to accumulate. There are short, medium, and long-term benefits to reducing exposure. You might stop using a perfume with fragrance, for example, that has fragrance on the label or phthalates on the label. And in a few days, you might see decreases in your sinus symptoms because phthalates are actually allergenic and irritants to the upper respiratory tract. In a few weeks, or just even a week or two, you might see changes in your hormonal levels. Not that I'm suggesting you check them in that way, but you will see changes in your hormonal function. That's how quickly the changes in your body work. And then in the months and years that follow, you see your decreases in your chronic disease risk profile. So there are short, medium, and long-term benefits to these safe and simple steps. So I began this talk by mentioning the leadership of Greta Thunberg, and that's really where I want to leave us with a message of hope. That is, and I think I'm too old to be the generation, I'm a Generation Xer, if you will. So I feel like it's the millennial and now the post-millennial group that really has already gotten woke to the notion of environment and its impact on human health. And that's why I feel like it's actually that group that is going to be the leadership on this front. And that's the audience that I'm actually most of all engaged with. No offense to those who might have grayer hair, if you will. In any case, I look forward to your questions and thank you for the opportunity.
How's the legal background in the US? Do you have something similar? So what's the legal protection level that is set, and how does that relate to reality?
So the United States does not have such a law that I'm aware of for that kind of medical device packaging or packaging period, unfortunately. And particularly the medical industry in the United States has actually often policed itself. The good news is that they actually are organizing working groups now across, first it was the children's hospitals, but then the hospitals writ large in the United States are starting to understand and appreciate that they just can't think about their climate footprint, which they are thinking about now. That was the first step. But they are thinking about the phthalates in the medical devices. And it was driven by studies identifying the very high levels in little babies in relationship to the newborn intensive care unit devices. You can imagine the endotracheal breathing tube, the nasal cannula, the intravenous, and these little babies who in some cases are 600 grams or less in size. So they're getting a very high dose. I mean, we talk about kids being vulnerable because pound for pound they breathe in more air, eat more food, drink more water, but that's an extreme but real example. There is no US regulation that I'm aware of that takes, for lack of a better way of saying it, a 1 generation or even a 7 generation approach to thinking about the consequences of chemical exposures in that way. If anything, we have the federal Superfund legislation for hazardous waste sites that takes that's the only thing that's out there. So if you have a hazardous waste spill, the EPA can sue, the Environmental Protection Agency can sue the company who made that dump, if you will, and get damages. However, many companies, and this is the other painful reality, by the time you get to that point, they've gone bankrupt or they've been subsumed. So we tend to, in the United States, use the lawsuit. You've probably seen the news about the glyphosate lawsuits in the United States. Not that I'm saying the evidence there is super strong about the carcinogenicity. I think there's a lot of debate that remains, and it depends on which side of the pond you are with respect to the scientific agencies, what the interpretation of the carcinogenicity is. I'm certainly concerned by that. I'm concerned about a host of other consequences. Just a word about organic and glyphosate, because it's so controversial and gets so muddy. Organic avoids the issue altogether because it by definition is GMO free. So you don't even have to deal with glyphosate in that respect at all. And you're getting the benefits of the better known neurotoxic pesticides that are affecting kids' brain development.
Okay, I will continue a story about what Per Summer told about the producer responsibility here. I will put down a little bit the message here, because he also said that we had had this for 25 years, but nobody has really complied. So it's not really only a question of the regulation, also have to be followed up, and we haven't really done that lesson yet. But what I think also would need to be addressed, and it's very important to discuss the burden of proof and how we manage that. And medical devices is actually a very interesting example, because it's not an area that is so very over-regulated as medical devices. And that can make us have a kind of feeling that, oh, it's so regulated, it's giving safety. But on the other hand, what you have already proven there, according to the medical devices regulation zone, is one of the worst phthalates. DHP is already there, it's approved. So then you have the other side, coming in with alternatives. It's so costly for you because you have to prove, for them have all the costs to prove that they are as good as DHP.
Yes.
So instead, it's stifling, actually the regulation is stifling development of the alternatives here. And I think DHP is nowhere in plastics, but only in medical devices. That's the explanation. It's so conservative, everything. So we have to discuss that kind of situation as well.
So let me reflect your question for the recording. And it's I see it as two parts. So there's the issue of burden of proof in general, and the burden of proof goes in two ways. One is, and we've not addressed this yet in the presentation, I can certainly take a few extra minutes to go into it. Burden of proof when you find something has an effect. But then what's the burden of proof of safety of the replacement? And let's take that step by step. So fundamentally, with no study, even I could argue a randomized controlled trial will prove causation or prove benefit. The reality is there are other factors in all study designs, interventional and observational, that have alternative explanations that you can't conceive of coming into a study. There's always a missing confounder that could be in the mix, that could be an alternative explanation. Don't get me wrong, I swear by randomized controlled trials for pharmaceuticals and other activities, and I'm not trying to pick on that, but I'm just trying to get past this strict causational argument that people use, and then they dismiss all observational studies saying that they're not causal. Causality was described by Sir Austin Bradford Hill in the context of the tobacco wars as a continuum of 0 to 1. It's either yes or no. And he made it very clear that it's a societal judgment and a judgment of context and stakes of a decision about weighing the evidence against those stakes. Let me unwrap that, because that was a complicated way of presenting it. So let's say you have a intentionally used paint that's used in an occupational setting and it causes cancer. Well, in that setting, if workers are using it and developing cancer as a result, and you have only fair evidence, maybe weak evidence of an effect, you might say, well, I don't want these workers to gamble with their health, so I'll intervene. Whereas if I decide all of you immediately cannot eat herring, I better have good evidence that the herring is really bad for you, because it's something that culturally is ingrained and is a regular part of many people, perhaps in the dietary profile of the audience. But I use those two extreme examples as a comparison, in that these decisions do not live in a pure scientific yes or no causal effect. And also, science constantly evolves and revisits that. At some level, the sun will rise every day only because we've observed the sun rising every day, and it rises again. And so we have developed a body of evidence over time that suggests the sun rises each day. I'm not trying to suggest that isn't a causal phenomena, but causality is more shades of gray than black or white. I'll make one final comment about your question about safer alternatives now for a moment, and say that we have to take great care to test properly chemicals and safer alternatives in particular with the same rigor that we would expect the legacy chemicals to have been tested, even if they've not. Because we cannot repeat this legacy time and again of BPS replacing BPA. I would argue, by the way, that we need to regulate chemicals by class. I mean, the perfluoroalkyl substances are the notorious category. We're talking about now thousands of PFAS. And PFOA is out, PFOS is starting to go out, but the reality is the short chains may have short half-life perfluoroalkyl substances. By the way, for the general audience, these perfluoroalkyl substances are heavy fluorine molecules, and they're these long or short carbon chains with fluorines attached to them. And so what the industry did when the long chains started to realize, people started to realize had a problem, they shortened the molecule with the idea that that would reset the way it got regulated, and there was a presumption of safety. But now we know that these chemicals may be impactful even though they run right out of the human body as fast as they're absorbed. The problem and a lot of the concern originally about the older perfluoroalkyl substances is that they stay in the body for years and contribute to cancer as well as a host of other consequences. So the core message there is that we need to develop a rigorous model for evaluating and almost putting the burden of proof of safety on the manufacturer or the person who wants to introduce the new chemical in the environment. We need to turn the tables on the burden of proof. Now I can get to your question, sorry. Thanks for your patience.
You talked about you had all the evidence regarding BPA, many years ago, but it wasn't until the media attention
Correct.
that you actually got something happening on a regulatory scale?
Yes.
How frustrated are you about that?
No, I'm not frustrated. I'd say a few things. First of all, that was a failure of science communication by the researchers who raised the concerns. If we had actually gotten the word out sooner, there was knowledge before 2008. The 2008 was I remember being on the Today Show in the United States about a major NIH National Institutes of Health report in the US about BPA. And I'm not saying that was the moment, but soon thereafter the ban happened, but that Today Show segment was already in the context of growing media attention to the topic. But there was science back in the 90s about BPA. Fred von Saal before the 90s that was showing concern, I think that as far back as the 80s, frankly, about BPA. And I'm not saying Fred and his colleagues didn't communicate well, but I do think we, as a community of scientists in environmental health, need to communicate both the context, the limitations, but also the real implications about gambling with our health when it comes to these adverse consequences of chemicals, especially insofar as they impact our hormones.
And how can that be done more efficiently to make sure that it's coming forward and not, because in the media environment, you really need to be very pushy to be able to get your message out and really have an impact. So if that is what requires, you can do all your studies at the universities, but it will not go out until someone thinks it's a good media story, which I find a bit frustrating. So how can we sort of have a better, make sure that we take care of the results from the science to policymakers in a more efficient way?
So part of it is actually, I'm going to turn this on its head, doing science that actually is more informative to policy. I actually don't put the blame on the media either. I do think we as scientists need to communicate better, but we also need to do science that is going to have a punchline, a byline that's much more direct. Now, the science may not lead us in that direction. It may lead us into a blind alley. But the reality is that we have to ask the right questions, and we have to think not only in terms of the questions that take us into a pedagogical understanding of biology, chemistry, and the environment, but also one that really is going to be actionable. That's why I have gravitated in my career towards doing a fair bit of disease burden and economic cost estimation, because I think that's actually something you can hand to a policymaker or decision maker and say, look, these are the stakes. You either decide what you want to do or not. I never say thou shalt regulate. I'm always saying, well, okay, it costs you $2 billion if you do this, or don't do this. If you regulate, you'll save $2 billion. And then I leave it and the assumptions are there, and that's actionable evidence. And I think that's where so there's two sides to the coin. Sometimes it's as much doing the science in the right way and asking the right question as it is communicating when you have that science. Thank you. Hi, yeah.
I actually had the same question or same as Frida, but I'll ask you another one.
Okay.
It's a lot more narrow. But you mentioned labeling in California or the US in total about 20 retardants or 20 retardants. Is that for specific substances or that is for the whole class? I mean, there's so many different varieties of that nowadays. Not only
So let me repeat the question for the recording. Question is, what's that I referred to labeling, and I was referring specifically to flame retardants, but they didn't narrow the universe to brominated flame retardants. It is just flame retardants, which was great because there are these replacement flame retardants for the brominated called the organophosphorus flame retardants that are showing up in carpeting and electronics and other materials, and that are not only maybe as toxic to the thyroid system, but also contributing to obesity potentially and have other adverse consequences. But in general, labeling has gotten a lot more momentum and attention, and I should say that multiple states, even with the US federal government being behind on the regulation, have started to step in. We have this thing Alexander Hamilton described in the Federalist Papers. There's this notion of federalism, that the states can step in and decide things and almost be the laboratories for the federal government. So lately we've seen Washington state in the US with a landmark legislation which got rid of the phthalates, the Teflon-like perfluoroalkyl substances, among other chemicals, and it also addressed bisphenols. New York, my home state, addressed toys, which is not perfect, but it's the first step towards something else. And I'm drawing a mental blank on other states. I mean, California has long led the way with a host of regulations in the space. But it was those regulations at the state level that actually snowballed into the US federal government revisiting its Toxic Substances Control Act for everything, for chemicals and their regulation in everything but food. And what we're seeing now is states stepping into the food packaging space. And there probably is going to be, with time, I don't think it's going to be before 2020, some pressure to reform the US Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act with respect to chemicals and the assumptions of food safety that are bizarre. Right now, the industry can assume safety and basically vouch for something as generally recognized as safe and throw up their hands without any responsibility, let alone one that goes to 25 years, as Thomas suggested.
Way of cheating with this labeling. Warning here. I heard, when you talk about regulators in chemistry, they have a kind of dividing line between chemicals and polymers. Polymers are not seen as chemicals,
yes,
according to regulations. So when you regulate additives like brominated flame retardants, they are within the REACH system. But as I heard from other sources in the industry, we are aware about that situation, and also they build in the flame retardants within the polymers, so they don't have to register anymore. I don't know if that could be the situation now in California as well, so they are under the radar.
Well, the question is that companies may be using polymers to hide single monomer chemicals that may be toxic and get away with using them even after a ban. My understanding, I could be incorrect, is that because those break down in many cases to the monomer, which is the chemical of concern, I'm not convinced that that would fly by the United States regulators so easily. but I could be mistaken. This is a little bit outside my expertise. My colleague who's in town today, Maricel Maffini, probably would know, at least with respect to food packaging. So I can't comment in detail. But we know, we are aware of these shell game maneuvers, and regulation resets a table, and then people try to walk around the table to go a different way. That's the how the maze is set and how the mice will play.
So, Leo, in your presentation, you talked a lot about kind of personal protective measures you
Yes.
can take. But I see now that the discussion is focusing very much on what could the public do, what do
Yes.
the responsibility of other actors. And just a reflection, I mean, you started out with the DDT example, and we have gone from focusing on a few very kind of hazardous chemicals,
Yes.
regulating those, to a different situation today where we have very many chemicals, and we are worried about the low dose exposure to multiple chemicals.
Mm-hmm.
And you said that in the US, in the food law, you had this extra assessment factor, for example.
Yes.
Is there anything like or if you reflect upon public responses, it could be in the EU or the US, that you would like to see in order
Yes.
to take account of these multiple exposures from many chemicals?
So just to reflect back for the recording, the question is or the statement is, in effect, you talked a lot about individual protective measures. What would be on your wish list for public, let's say regulatory and other legislative or other operational governmental changes? In the United States, at least, I would like to see the generally recognized as safe exemption basically evaporated and substituted with a framework that requires testing. I would dream of having an independently funded global or multinational entity that would be a central throughput for proper screening and evaluation of chemicals across the board, be it those in food packaging or food contact substances, as well as other materials for their various pathways of effect. We can debate the specific testing modules. There's the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development that has its modules of testing. There's the European approach. The Japanese have their own approach. But that would at least get us to debate and get us to a point where they're actually done regularly. There's often so much debate about what testing is done, and a lack of funding, when a lack of funding is simply the biggest problem, I would argue, at all. There are just so few chemicals tested properly. We know of 1,000 chemicals that are endocrine disrupting chemicals, but that's only because we've tested a few thousand. We've not tested the suite of 30,000 or more that are, at least I'm using 30,000 as my number because it's the updated U.S. Environmental Protection Agency number based on chemicals used above 1 ton per year as of 2017. But it could be a bigger number. I understand 143,000 chemicals are registered at the European level through ECHA. But it's probably more like 50,000 rather than, or closer to 30,000 than 143,000. I think there's some duplicates in that 143, by the way, that drives the number to be so high because it's registrations. So I hope that's helpful. So just to recap, I would suggest getting rid of GRAS and having some kind of international body for oversight and testing. Frankly, I would like to see the European hazard-based assessment approach be the norm for evaluating chemicals. I think when you get into a risk-based evaluation, you get fraught with delays in evidence, and you get into substantial economic debates about trade-offs that can delay the debate in a way that is not necessarily productive.
Thanks. We have Thomas. Others that want to ask questions? We have 2 over here.
Oh, great.
Let's start with 3 questions, and then we'll take 3 more. So,
Okay.
because sometimes you sit waiting, and then in the end there is no time. So better to voice them and so on. So Thomas, please.
So, yeah, first one tiny question as a matter just for my education. I was confused. Are BPA, phthalates, and lead, are they all endocrine disruptors?
So bisphenol A is a known endocrine disruptor. Phthalates are known endocrine disruptors. Lead is classified as among the 1,000 endocrine disruptors, but it's not. I would argue that there is debate about whether lead's primary effect is endocrine disruption, for example, on neurodevelopment. I think there is more evidence of direct neurotoxicity, as in lead gets into the developing brains of these kids and directly acts there, as opposed to acting through a hormone.
And then I had a more policy-oriented question. Many countries are fond of banning plastic bags.
Yes.
Is this useful?
And straws.
Yeah. Is this useful from the viewpoint that you're of endocrine disruption, or could the policy? It's often a policy that verges on the slightly populistic. I mean, it is useful in some sense, but it's often a sort of a symbolic gesture. Is there some way of making the policy more useful by saying that we should ban the bags with phthalates in it, or whatever? I mean, be more detailed about this.
So the question was whether bans on plastic bags and straws are the most effective policy path. So I have a two.
Can we collect a couple of more?
You want to collect the questions?
A bit more.
Wow, you're testing my cerebral function, but I'll take it. Okay, so the second question, in the back.
Oh, thank you. I'm just a concerned consumer, so how
Yes.
rigorous should we avoid plastic packaging with food? I mean, how does your personal grocery look like for your kids?
So the second question, just as a parking lot, is how does a consumer deal with the plastic chaos in our lives? And what do I do in my own personal lifestyle, which I'm happy to answer. But we'll get the third question, and then I will come around.
Yep, so my question is a bit related to that. I hope it's not an ignorant one, but what about
There's no ignorant question here.
organic food in plastic packaging? Is the plastic included? Or is that completely?
So the question, it's a great one actually, is what do you do about organic food? What about the organic banana in a plastic wrap, or the organic cucumber in a plastic wrap, which I often see myself? So that's a great question, and there are no ignorant questions, so please. So I'm going to come back to your question about the bans on plastic bags and straws. So to me, I see the laws as great sentinels for a broader conversation on why we have plastic in the first place in our environment. Now, as a contribution to the entirety of the plastic utilization, and the reality being that recycling is maybe 10% of the actual plastic that's used, I don't think it really scratches the surface. It scratches an itch, and that itch should be a warning sign. It does open, again, a conversation to the broader use of plastic in our environment. I just came back from, last week I was in Japan, which tells you how many time zones I'm dealing with right now. But the reason I bring this up is plastic is extremely ubiquitous in Japan. Every place you go, like every couple of blocks, I don't know if it's because of 3 a.m. partying in Tokyo or what have you, but you can get plastic bottles of water cold in any, and they're all the small serving size. They're not the large size. You barely see glass. That is not addressed by plastic bag bans or plastic or surcharges I've seen, or straw efforts. Now, there's a consciousness that I think comes with an awareness of the issue that I think then is a gateway into the debate. But we're going to have to fundamentally rethink our plastic freeness if we're really going to tackle the broader plastic ocean contamination, not to mention the human contamination with chemicals in plastics. So I think it's a conversation starter. I don't hold people back from doing that in the policy debate because I think that's one thing I learned about my year working on Capitol Hill for then Senator Hillary Rodham Clinton is that you have to have those markers sometimes. You have to put the foot in the door to actually open the door. But from a perspective of reducing the plastic burden on our planet, it's barely entering the discussion. So I hope that answers the first question. Now I'm going to pivot to your question, which is terribly important. So let me tell you what's in our home first, which I think it should tell you a lot. There's very little plastic, period. We try very hard to have glass everything. We have, so my kids are 11 and 9. One of the kids' schools, actually both kids' schools now have buffet style lunch. So actually they don't have the packaged phthalate lunch. I didn't do that by design, but I'm very excited about that. But before that, one of my sons changed schools. We actually did have to send in food. And what we had to do was we had these, glass was not allowed. So we had these aluminum tin-lined containers that had plastic around them. So we actually had to use a plastic outer layer, but we would wash the inner layer so as to avoid having to wash or reuse the plastic outer layer. So what I'm saying is that there are workarounds. I sometimes give in and have a plastic water bottle if I'm on the run. If I'm on a plane, obviously I am going to drink plastic water because I am not going to get a stomach illness on the way here and then not be able to give this presentation. That would be awfully awkward. We eat organic whenever we can. If I don't buy organic, I get the riot act from my 11-year-old. He's not just bought into climate change, by the way, so that should tell you something. He's vegan to boot, so that really makes it interesting for us. So I hope I've answered your question from that perspective. I don't say it's easy in the world we live in, but already, at least where I live and where I've seen a lot of people live in the United States and here in Europe too, the consciousness has elevated already substantially, and we have moved so far. I mean, I grew up in the 1970s where plastic was everywhere. I mean, it's from the movie The Graduate from the 1960s, Dustin Hoffman, 67. So it's the line is, I can never get it exactly right. It's the advice that this older guy gives Dustin Hoffman as the character saying, this is my advice for your career and your existence, plastics, one word. I think we've come a long way since there. And I do think that the ocean plastics dialogue has fundamentally accelerated the broader debate about phthalates and other chemicals used in these plastics as well. The challenge has been trying to harmonize the dialogue around that because there's a perception that microplastics has greater risk than macroplastics, and I really see it much more about what the chemicals are that get into our body as affecting us directly and being the most actionable, whether or not the microplastics are mediating it or the macroplastics are. I don't see the evidence yet either about the microplastic effects on human health in that same way, and that's in part because the field is still evolving in that respect. We have a long way to go to understand that. But there's enough evidence to do things about plastic bags and straws, about ocean plastics, and about avoiding plastic exposure in our human lives by reducing plastic, period, in our lives. So I hope that wandered my way to the answer, I think. Okay, great. So plastic organic food is, to me, an irony that hurts me, because you've made so much effort to make something organic, and then the worst is where I've seen a plastic wrapped organic cucumber in a plastic container, and that is, inside my brain is swelling. But I mean, if your choice is the plastic wrapped non-organic banana as opposed to the plastic wrapped organic banana, I'm going to pick the plastic wrapped organic banana. But sometimes what I've done, and this goes a long way, it's a little impressive to do, but I think we all can do it, I think we've all got the ability to do it, is if you go to the owner or to the staff person and say, do you know that this is unnecessary plastic? And simply just having a conversation. If you say it in a nice way, it doesn't come off as rude at least 90% of the time. There are 10% of the time I've gotten really weird facial expressions, and I know to back away, it's like, I'm sorry. I just thought I would make this point, and clearly this is not the place or the time, but then you can decide not to shop there at some level. And I think that is a reason why it's worth bringing up that conversation, because these companies depend on your money to continue being productive. So I see there are a couple questions here.
Yes, there are 3 questions, I think.
Should we bundle them again, or do you want to test me again by bundling, or do you want to do them one by one?
Well, it depends how long your answers are, I think. I think we are closer to stick to time if we bundle them.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay, so I'll go first. Thank you. You mentioned Japan, Europe, and the US, and how do you see that increasing awareness of legislation, regulations in these corners have an impact on what happens in China, Brazil, and the wider world? How do you see that? Do you get invited also to these countries? What do you see? I don't know enough about the industry, how much industry is actually that the big brands in these OECD countries also are the producers for the others or not. But can you enlighten me on how does the transformation of tighter regulation, better plastics and less plastics move out in the world? Thank you.
Sounds good. So just to repeat the question is, how does the focus of Japan, Europe, and the US translate to the BRICS and the low and middle income countries and the rest of the world? Great.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in Europe right now we have a discussion around circular economy.
Yes.
Promoting recycled material, especially plastic.
Yes.
So, in my experience, very often when you use recycled plastics, you have absolutely no idea what's in it, the chemical content. So, I wonder if you have any comments on the use of recycled plastic.
Yes. So just for the video recording, there's a question about the circular economy, which is a very prominent notion, has gotten a lot of momentum, and what the impact is of recycled plastics on human health. And then there's one, Thomas, you're passing. That is very humble of you, and not my usual interaction with you, which is not making fun of you. I just think it's really nice. There you go. Thank you. Tuck, tuck. Okay. Was there a third question otherwise? Oh, in the back. Oh, there's a fourth question too.
I'm just curious about your definition of endocrine disrupting chemicals.
Yes.
I have a lot of discussions about that. I have colleagues that claim that all chemicals can be regarded as EPCs.
Yeah.
It's quite complex and can be affected in many different ways.
So the question is, how do you define an EDC? And I will be delighted to go into that. Sometimes in this presentation, I do that right at the beginning. For some reason, I didn't do that in the flow, but I'll address that. Let me get to the fourth question, and then we'll come back around, and you'll test my memory. So whether the U.S. is having a dialogue in the younger populations about the impact of these exposures on their lives beyond fertility and, what was the other thing? Yeah, okay, beyond fertility, okay.
7 minutes.
7 minutes, okay, so this is a bullet round, okay. So I would say in low and middle income countries, there is some momentum. To some extent, there is a reliance on a process internationally called the Strategic Alliance for International Chemicals Management, or SICM. Now, SICM is the UN body for dealing with endocrine disrupting chemicals. And endocrine disrupting chemicals, well, it's the UN process for chemicals, period, but endocrine disrupting chemicals are a high profile issue area there, focus area there. They welcome the UN report. I would say Brazil has made some policy progress, at least saying that pesticides have to be banned if they have endocrine disrupting chemical properties. I don't know what the enforcement has been, especially in the context of the Bolsonaro administration. So that's as far as I can go in that regard. China, I think, has been more aware of this issue than you would expect, in part because of the two-child policy now, and the focus historically on child health and the subsequent generations. And it's also the centralization of its health ministry as in the bottom line of its government structure. So if its economy is suffering as a result of healthcare costs related to EDCs, it's internalized the cost structure, whereas in the US, diseases due to EDCs are paid for by insurance that ultimately is paid for by private citizens. So there's a bit of a separate structure. That is let's say if your nationalized industry is doing harm on its citizens, you're in the same spreadsheet. Whereas if your corporate industry is affecting people outside the others in two spreadsheets, you don't see the problem you're doing on the other side of the spreadsheet. So with respect to the circular economy and recycled plastics, this is where there is a big problem, because there is, for example, BPA, even though it's BPA-free plastic, it's probably got leftover BPA from the ubiquity of BPA in water, in pantyhose, in thermal paper, in food. It's almost like the issue we're going to have with perfluoroalkyl substances that are in everything now. I mean, there's a Maine dairy farmer that has it in his soil, and he's freaked out. He dumped all his milk because it was contaminated with the highest detectable levels of perfluoroalkyl substances. That's not a plastic issue, but it speaks to the problem with the circular economy paradigm in that it doesn't really account fully for chemical contamination. It makes things rather uncomfortable, and again speaks to minimizing use, period. And that is, I would argue it's an area where we have to stay tuned, that I think there will be pressure to go in that direction, but I don't think the topic has ripened or the awareness has ripened in a way that it's really going to allow us to have a genuine dialogue about, if Japan all of a sudden had to have glass containers in those things, you'd have to redesign the manufacturing of these vending machines fundamentally, for example. So it's tricky. The third question is the definition of an endocrine disrupting chemical. So an endocrine disrupting chemical has to have two properties. It has to disrupt hormones, and that doesn't have to be at the receptor level. It can be by changing the way genes are expressed, or something even as intermediate on the way to having a hormonal effect, and it then has to contribute to a disease endpoint. So it has to connect the dots. There's a lot of people who say, well, coffee is an endocrine disruptor. By the way, I'm going to have a sip of coffee. And I fundamentally think that's a skewed and distorted way of thinking about endocrine disrupting chemicals. So we're talking about the reality that there are a suite of synthetic chemicals that have been added to our environment and added to our lives that are disrupting hormones in ways that violate the physiologic norms. Of course, there are phytoestrogens and naturally derived chemicals that perturb hormonal function, but we've lived with those for generation after generation after generation. How many generations have eaten soy, for example? And if not, it's not as if the Asian population is small in the globe, right? So I find that the representation that that mustard is an endocrine disruptor, for example, which I've heard recently, is just intentionally misleading the dialogue in a way that doesn't constructively address the real magnitude of the problem. And your question, which is actually a nice way to wrap it up, which is, how do we bring this issue home to the younger generations where the impact is greatest? I think we still have some work to do in the endocrine disruptor field to link to climate change a bit more directly, because I do think there are some connections there and some commonalities. Endocrine disruption is similar to climate change in that it has so many different consequences on people's lives that derive from one central phenomenon. But what's central to endocrine disruption and climate change is petroleum-based fuels. And ultimately, petroleum-based fuels are the feedstock for plastics. The reason why we have an addiction to plastics is because we have leftover byproducts from petroleum fuels that feed the need to act like we're recycling rather than addressing our plastic use and addiction, period. So if we can really hone in on the duality of those forces, and I don't think they're competitive discussions. I think you can have a discussion about what plastics are doing in phthalates and to our fertility and our potency and to our obesity and our heart disease. You can address all those in one fell swoop by fundamentally addressing the fact that fossil fuels are undermining our overall vitality as a planet and as a population. I think there are people who think these dialogues compete with each other, and I just don't see it that way. If anything, I think it actually gives a more specific form and concrete you can document someone's exposure to phthalates. You can't document someone's exposure to climate change in that discrete kind of way. So I think they mutually support each other, and I think that's the way forward.
Thanks a lot for this presentation.
Thank you.
It was really, really interesting. So
awesome.
Yeah,
Thank you. Cool.